The name Kidderminster first appears in the Domesday Book, which was compiled for William the Conqueror in 1086. At that date, the king himself had possession of the large manor of Kidderminster, with its 16 satellite settlements. The Kidder part of the name is obscure and controversial. The Minster part denotes a church, or even a monastery. The oldest part of the present parish church of St. Mary and All Saints dates to well over 200 years later than Domesday Book, but we know the names of rectors from the late 12th century. St. Mary's Church, set on its hill, cannot be hid, to use a biblical expression, even at night. But there may have been an earlier ecclesiastical site on the other side of the River Stour. A local legend says that the church was originally commenced in that part of Kidderminster which has sometimes been called Cussfield, the Mill Lane area, but that during the night the stones were moved by angels to the present site. Eventually it was accepted that the present situation was divinely ordained, and building was recommenced there. The legend is commemorated on the tower of the present St. Mary's Church. Though this sculpture of an angel carrying the segment of an arch dates to the last years of the 19th century, it's a copy of a 15th century original. About 70 years after Domesday Book was compiled for King William, another king, Henry II, gave Kidderminster to his steward, a man called Manser Bissett. The deed by which he did so, of the 1150s, is still in the archives of the town of Kidderminster, though it now only survives in a 17th century copy. Bissett owned but did not live in Kidderminster, nor did any of its later lords. However, the parish church has the tombs and monuments of the men and women of 3 locally based families which are important in the history of the town: the Cokeses, the Blounts, and the Clares. 2 of these families, the Cokeses and the Clares, owned one of the town's few remaining medieval buildings, the tower called Caldwell Tower. This tower was added in about 1400 to an existing manor house owned by the Cokeses. It was probably built by Sir Walter Cokesy before his death in 1405. In St. Mary's Church there are 3 monuments relating to members of the Cokesy family. Earliest in date is a brass which shows a member of the Cokesy family, Walter, his wife Matilda, born Matilda Harcourt, and her second husband, Sir John Philip. The Latin inscription tells us that Sir John, who came from Dennington in Suffolk, distinguished himself at the siege of Harfleur in 1415, the year in which Henry V, who regarded him as a personal friend, won his famous victory over the French at Agincourt. Sir John died in that same year, having been made Baron of Dennington by the king. The brass, one of the finest in Worcestershire, shows both Sir John Philip and Walter Cokesy wearing the chain of SS, which denotes their connection with the ruling house of Lancaster. In the chancel of the church is the tomb of Sir Hugh Cokesy, the son of the Walter and Matilda shown on the brass. Sir Hugh died in 1445 at Minster Lovell in Oxfordshire. His body was brought back to Kidderminster in the 1460s by his sister Joyce. The other effigy is that of his second wife, Alice. The third of the Cokesy monuments is that of Sir Hugh's sister, Joyce. Joyce died in 1473 as Lady Joyce Beauchamp, her title from her first marriage to Sir Walter Beauchamp of Powick, which she retained even though she had 2 further husbands, both of whom she survived. Consequently, she's shown with a chin muffler called a widow's barb. This fine tomb was damaged in the 18th century when its pinnacles were shorn off by a superimposed gallery. If Kidderminster's leading family in the 15th century was the Coxes, it was the Blunts in the 16th. The parish church has 2 Blunt tombs. The earlier is of Thomas Blunt, who died in 1568. Thomas, like Sir Edward, his father, was a servant of the Dudley family. The most famous of them is Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, favourite to Queen Elizabeth I. And the chain he wears around his neck may denote his position as Robert Dudley's steward at Kenilworth Castle. Thomas Blunt was MP for Worcestershire and a member of the Council of the Marches of Wales. A panel above the tombs of Thomas Blunt and his wife Marjorie, née Poley, shows their children. The 2 eldest boys shown are E.B., Edward Blunt, and C.B., Christopher Blunt. Of these, the more important in national terms was the younger, Sir Christopher Blunt. Sir Edward Blunt lived until 1630 and was a figure of great local significance. His tomb, which shows his first wife Mary, née Neville, and his second wife Mary, née Wigmore, has suffered much damage. It originally had a canopy and a long Latin inscription extolling his virtues, both now lost. The tomb has been in various places in the church, but is now in roughly its original position. The borough of Kidderminster seems to have originated in the 12th century, when a rectangular market area, clearly visible in Doherty's 1753 map of the town, was laid out, with the present Coventry Street, Worcester Street, Vicar Street, and the road to the Bull Ring at its angles. The tolls on goods sold in the marketplace belonged to the lords of the manor, who were, from the 14th century, the Barons Abergavenny. In the 1620s, the bailiff and burgesses of the town claimed these tolls for themselves. Lord Abergavenny took them to court, and won. In the court case, the bailiff and burgesses had been forced to admit that they were no corporation, and the humiliation that the incident brought led to a petition being sent to King Charles I for a charter of incorporation in 1633. This eventually led to Kidderminster's charter of 1636. The 1636 charter named Sir Ralph Clare of Caldwell as the town's first High Steward. Sir Ralph Clare was the leading man in Kidderminster from 1630, when Sir Edward Blount died, to his own death in 1670. His father, Sir Francis, had acquired the Caldwell estate in 1589, and the Clares would hold it till 1777. They were responsible for the rebuilding of Caldwell Castle in around 1700. There is a floor monument to Sir Ralph Clare next to the tomb of another owner of Caldwell, Lady Joyce Beauchamp. The inscription stresses his loyalty and service to the House of Stuart. He was also a staunch adherent of the Anglican Church, after its ceremonies and liturgy were banned on the defeat of the king in the Civil War of 1642-6. Paradoxically, Sir Ralph's chief claim to fame is not his loyalty to the old order in church and state, but his opposition to Richard Baxter during his ministry in the town. Few visitors to Kidderminster can depart unaware of Richard Baxter's connection with the town. Most obviously, there's his 1875 statue below the parish church. It formerly stood in the Bull Ring. The parish church of St. Mary and All Saints has a chair which may have belonged to him. The United Reformed Church, which is called after him, has his communion table and a portrait of him. The New Meeting Unitarian Church has the pulpit from which he preached, which was formerly in St. Mary's. Richard Baxter, a Shropshire man, came to Kidderminster in 1641, not as vicar, but as a lecturer, an old term denoting a preacher. A few months later, on the eve of the outbreak of the Civil War, he was lucky to escape being lynched by a mob of what he later called the drunken riotous party of the town, poor journeymen and servants, who were annoyed by an attempt to remove a crucifix from a churchyard cross. The stump of that cross remains in the churchyard. Because of incidents of this nature, Baxter left the town in 1642 and did not return until 1647. From 1647 until the restoration of King Charles II in 1660, Baxter was minister in the town, a ministry which is now world famous. Its fame derives from Baxter's threefold achievement: as a preacher, a pastor, and as an author. Baxter says that 5 extra galleries had to be built to accommodate the number of people wanting to hear him preach. These galleries were probably lofts between the pillars on the south side, like the ones shown in Edward Bradley's 1845 drawing of the church, though these were of the late 18th century. Baxter's achievement as a pastor, as a shepherd of souls, is that he knew the 4,000 people in his charge, and in the last 5 years of his ministry, he regularly interviewed many of them in his own house in High Street, family by family, interviews at which he taught them the faith or strengthened their practice of it, and with the unconverted pleaded with them to reform their lives. Few families went from me without some tears or seemingly serious promises for a godly life, he later wrote. His fame and influence nationally, however, mainly depended while he was at Kidderminster on the books he wrote while he was here, some of them versions of sermons he'd preached. These included The Saints' Everlasting Rest, published in 1650, and The Reformed Pastor of 1656. Baxter presented a copy of his Saints' Everlasting Rest, the second edition of 1651, to the bailiff and burgesses of the town, and asked that it should be handed down from bailiff to bailiff. The copy he presented has disappeared, but a copy of the book is still signed by each new mayor of Kidderminster on taking office. When Baxter left the town in 1661, he left behind a number of men and women who found the liturgy of the restored Church of England unsatisfactory. These were the people who built the first nonconformist meeting house, opened for worship in 1694. The building was in the Bull Ring, on roughly the site of the present Baxter Church, built in 1885, which is the 4th place of worship on the site. In 1781, a breakaway group left the meeting house congregation, partly due to a disagreement about the doctrine of the Trinity, to form their own church. The new meeting congregation, as it was called, built a church at the bottom of Church Street. The leading member of the breakaway congregation, Nicholas Pearsall, was the man who bought Baxter's pulpit when it was ejected by the parish church in about 1785, thus saving a precious artifact for the town. When he died in 1798, Nicholas Pearsall was buried by his own desire in the forecourt of New Meeting, and his gravestone may still be seen. Kidderminster was a cloth-making town from at least the 12th century, and the river played a vital role in the washing of dyed cloth and the striking or fixing of its colours. Kidderminster owes its cloth and carpet industries, at least in part, to the River Stour, which played a vital role in both industries. Cloth was made here from the 12th century, and the making of carpets began in the year 1735, when Kidderminster or Scotch carpets began to be made in the town. In about 1749, John Broom and John Pearsall set up a carpet hall for the manufacture of Brussels carpets in the part of Kidderminster which used to be called Mount Skippet. This carpet hall on Mount Skippet is clearly shown, near what are still called the Park Butts, on John Doherty's 1753 map of the town. The park referred to in Park Butts was the park of the Caldwell estate, and the land on which Broom and Pearsall built their carpet hall was owned by Francis Clare of Caldwell. A cartouche of Doherty's map shows cherubs unrolling a Kidderminster Brussels carpet for the benefit of Britannia. Another cartouche has a legend which proudly proclaims the town's newly acquired prosperity as a result of the carpet industry, and also the recently revived stuff manufacture. The lord of the manor, Lord Foley, to whom Doherty dedicated his exact plan, laid out the new streets, Hall Street, Orchard Street, Paddock Street, and so on what were formerly the grounds of the manor house or hall, and also built over 300 new houses for the artisan weavers who moved into the town. The present Mount Skippet cottage may be on the site of cottages mentioned in a deed of 1758 as being leased to John Broom by Francis Clare. Though Broom and Pearsall built what was in effect a carpet factory on Mount Skippet, This was the exception rather than the rule. The production of carpets from 1750 to 1850 took place mostly in the houses of weavers, in sheds at the back of their houses, or in loom shops with perhaps 4 looms. There are still some houses in the town where a number of high windows in a narrow gable indicates an attic loom shop for domestic production, which needed the maximum amount of light. By 1830, the major carpet manufacturers like John Lee or John Broome, the descendant of the carpet pioneer, each owned upward of 200 looms dispersed in different parts of the town, and another 4 firms each had over 100 looms. The great watershed came in the 1850s with the introduction of the steam-driven power loom. This spelt the end for domestic handloom carpet production, and all production was soon factory-based. Kidderminster, as a town shaped by the carpet industry, is really a product of the period after the 1850s. The greatest concentrations of carpet making were perhaps the Green Street, Dixon Street New Road area, where even now you can get the feeling of a carpetopolis, a carpet city, though most of the carpet factories are now used for other purposes, and the Mount Skippet, Park Butts, Mill Street area. This is the period which saw the expansion of those firms which still remain familiar names today: Woodward Grosvenor, Carpet Manufacturing Company, Tompkinson's, and most famously, Brinton's. In the transitional period in the 1850s, several important handloom manufacturers went bankrupt, and others may not have made the transition to power looms but for the paternalistic intervention of the now Lord of the Manor, Lord Ward, later the first Earl of Dudley, whose family had bought the manor from the Foleys. Lord Ward provided a specially built factory for the new power looms. Known as Lord Ward's Shed, it was erected in Green Street and is now part of Woodward Grosvenor & Co. Limited. Until the 1880s, it was mainly Wilton carpets that were produced on the new power looms. Then came a period dominated by the making of cheaper Axminster carpets, a development pioneered by American carpet manufacturers. Chris Brighton and Geoffrey Smith of the Sultana Carpet Company in Stourport have in their premises 11 power Axminster looms made by Crompton & Knowles at Worcester, Massachusetts in the USA in 1878, and installed in the 1880s in the Kidderminster firm of Richard Smith, later Carpet Manufacturing Company, where they were operated by women. These looms are a tangible reminder of the Kidderminster carpet industry in its palmiest days. From the early 19th century, carpet manufacturers who had previously lived close to their factories built large, elegant houses for themselves, for example, Broomfield Hall, on the outskirts of the town. One area where this occurred was Blakebrook, where from the 1830s, carpet masters who wanted to get away from the unhealthy atmosphere of the town centre built fine houses in this salubrious and socially select suburb. The increased population of the suburb led to the building of St. John's Church in 1842 and 43, known as the Black Church because of the blue-black brick used by the architect George Alexander, a military engineer. St. John's was not the first Anglican church built in Kidderminster in the 19th century. The first was St. George's, a commissioner's or Waterloo church of 1821 to 24, largely paid for out of a parliamentary fund which provided money for churches to be built in populous areas. The architect was Francis Goodwin, and the clerk of works was William Knight, whose tomb stands near the west door. Both churches had been under the parish church of St. Mary's. St. Mary's was itself to see great changes during the 19th century. In 1841, a new vicar, Thomas Lee Claughton, came. Educated at Oxford, Claughton was influenced by the Oxford movement. During his stay in Kidderminster, 1841 to 67, he was able to effect a decisive change in many ways. The services at the parish church became more reverent and had a vastly improved attendance. Music and choral singing were given a much larger role in the church's worship. Claughton also presided over major structural reordering of the church in 1847 to 48. When he died in 1892, it was decided to commemorate his work in Kidderminster by a series of stained glass windows in the clerestory depicting the Benedicite, the Song of the Three Children. The glass was made by the Birmingham firm of Hardman and Powell, and the blues and reds in the 19 windows make a very effective sequence. There are 3 other windows commemorating Bishop Claughton on the north side of the nave, with glass by Powell's of Whitefriars. Not the least of the claims to fame of the Thomas Blunts, who was referred to earlier, is that in 1566 he used lands which he had acquired in Kidderminster to endow the free grammar school, which he founded in the town. The school was housed in a chapel of about 1530, paid for, we happen to know, by a man called Simon Rice. Now called the Chantry, it was then a detached building at the east end of the parish church. The Chantry was the home of the free grammar school, which in his charter of 1636 King Charles I allowed to be called the Free Grammar School of Charles, King of England in Kidderminster, from 1566 to 1848. By the late 18th century, the grammar school was made up of 2 schools, which functioned more or less independently. An upper school, where the headmaster taught mainly Greek and Latin, and a lower school, where an usher or writing master taught the boys to write and simple arithmetic. The 2 schools were both held in the Chantry, but were divided by a partition. In 1848, the grammar school moved to purpose-built premises on Bewdley Road, where it remained until 1977, when it amalgamated with 2 other local grammar schools to form the present King Charles I High School on a different site. The castellated but also ecclesiastical appearance of the buildings on Bewdley Road makes them appear much older than their date of 1848. But we have to remember that at this date Gothic was king, and also that it was clearly felt desirable that boys moving from a 16th century building should move to premises not too dissimilar from the ones they were leaving. It was not until the 19th century that proper provision for girls' education was made. The Kidderminster High School for Girls was housed first at Needwood House, formerly Townsend House, at Proud Cross, and later in new specially built premises in Chester Road, which form the nucleus of the present King Charles I High School. Miss Caroline Bennett, who became the first headmistress of the Kidderminster High School for Girls, brought with her 75 pupils from a school which she'd conducted at Broomfield Hall, the former home of the Broom family, for several years. In 1907, the County Council took over the girls' high school. It then built the new buildings, which were opened in October 1912 by the Countess of Dudley. Kidderminster sent 2 MPs to Edward I's Model Parliament of 1295. But the town had no more MPs until after the Great Reform Act of 1832, since which time the town has chosen a single MP. The first MP in this period was Richard Godson, a barrister from Tenbury, elected in December 1832. Godson had won popularity in the town by defending some of the weavers who were prosecuted because of their riotous behaviour during the 1828 strike. His parliamentary career was somewhat checkered. Chosen in 1832, he was defeated in 1835, and elected again in 1837 and 1841, and yet again in 1845. These elections were marred by two things, which are almost a leitmotif of Kidderminster elections in the 19th century: bribery and violence. The 1857 election in the town was marked by a minimal amount of bribery and a maximum of violence. Robert Lowe was first elected for Kidderminster in 1852 as a Liberal who announced that he would not engage in any form of bribery. He was returned unopposed in 1855. In the 1857 election, however, he was opposed by a local Conservative, William Boycott. Once again, Lowe refused to adopt traditional Kidderminster electoral practices, the bribe and the beer barrel, though Boycott was probably less scrupulous. Lowe won by 234 votes to 146. Boycott supporters, who included a large number of carpet weavers, became restive. The principal voting place was on Blakebrook Green at the west end of the town. Robert Lowe and his supporters were intending to go in a kind of victory procession to the town hall. But as the procession moved off, they were pelted with stones and rotten eggs. There were cries of "Boycott forever" and "Kill the pink eye." Lowe was an albino. Robert Lowe was hit several times and was bleeding profusely. The procession inched its way down the road past St. John's Church till it came opposite Woodfield House, which still stands, the residence of Dr. Shepherd, headmaster of the adjacent grammar school. Lowe's supporters dragged the now scarcely conscious MP into the house, and when the rioters attempted to follow, Dr. Shepherd's boarding pupils, who also lived in the house, produced pistols, which had a suitably deterrent effect. There can be little doubt that Lowe's life was saved by the courageous and resourceful behavior of Dr. Shepherd and his intrepid boarders. The 1906 election involved a future Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, for the Conservatives, and Mr. E.B. Barnard for the Liberals. The experience of the campaign was not a happy one for the young Stanley Baldwin, born in Bewdley and the son of a Wilden ironmaster. In a 1926 address as Prime Minister to the Classical Association, he recalled that the candidate was expected to spend 3 evenings a week during the time of his probation in one or another of the public houses which jostled each other through the constituency, listening to what were called comic or humorous songs. He remembered that later on, during these evenings, he would dip into the classics of Greek and Latin literature as a restorative tonic. He also recalled that the Kidderminster electors, like their 19th century predecessors, expected the candidates to instruct them how to vote on the understanding that they would be rewarded with free drinks for their compliance. In the end, he lost to Barnard by 271 votes, a creditable result in what was, nationally, a Liberal landslide. The outstanding Kidderminster MP of the 20th century was perhaps Sir Gerald Nabarro, MP 1950-64. Sir Gerald was a Conservative in the tradition of Disraeli, combining an exotic name and appearance with, occasionally, the dress of a dandy. Sir Gerald was a man of strong personality and incisive utterance, who was one of the most colourful members of the House of Commons of his time. Possibly the finest street in the town is Church Street. In the early 19th century, a large number of the inhabitants of Church Street were involved in the carpet trade. And it's been noted that the carpet manufacturers and their weavers lived in close proximity in the street, at a time when carpet masters with premises in other streets were moving to the healthier suburbs of the town. This harmony may have owed something to the good fellowship created by an annual supper held on Midsummer Eve to promote good neighbourliness. Even today, Church Street has an ethos unlike that of any other street in Kidderminster. Kidderminster has many famous sons. However, only one of them is commemorated by a statue in his native town. The statue of Sir Rowland Hill was erected in 1881, 2 years after his death, in front of the Corn Exchange, built in 1855. Rowland Hill was born in Blackwell Street in the town on the 3rd of December 1795, and he belonged to a family resident in Kidderminster since at least the 17th century. He was the third son of Thomas Wright Hill and his wife Sarah, née Lee. Thomas Wright Hill was a pioneer in progressive education, and Rowland became, at the age of 12, an assistant in his father's school, Hilltop, in Birmingham. Though Rowland Hill was a gifted teacher and an educational pioneer, his main claim to fame is as the man who reformed and decisively altered the postal system. It was largely owing to his inventiveness that a black penny stamp showing Queen Victoria's head came into use in May 1840. Postage had previously been paid by the recipients of letters. Though Sir Rowland Hill spent only a few years as a small boy in the town of his birth, Kidderminster has good reason to be proud of him. The 20th century has seen several royal visits to Kidderminster. They include the 1957 visit of Queen Elizabeth II and the 1986 visit of Diana, Princess of Wales. Here is precious archive film of the visit paid by the Duke of York, the future George VI, on the 21st of July 1926. He came to open extensions to the hospital in Mill Street and also paid a visit to the Mount Pleasant carpet factory of Messrs. Tompkinson and Adam. Kidderminster, visited by the Duke of York in 1926, was a moderately prosperous town. More prosperous, certainly, than it would be in the 1930s. There was much more activity in the town for whole families to engage in than now, and the actual centre was busier and livelier, with cinemas and several large hotels. Some archive film shot in the 20s shows what the town was like at that period, and it also provided an opportunity for some shops to advertise their wares and services. The 20th century has seen 2 world wars. During the 1939-45 war, there were 620 air raid warnings, and German bombs, parachute-guided mines and incendiaries fell in Kidderminster on 6 occasions, and in 6 different locations. near Hoobrook in Hoo Road, in the Marlpool-Puxton area near Hercot, near Platt's Wharf, and the last and most devastating occasion was on the 17th of May 1941, when Harry Cheshire School opened in 1940 and a large number of houses in St John's Avenue were damaged. The only fatality occurred on the 12th of December 1940, when a 70-year-old woman living in Lee Street was killed by the nose cap of a British anti-aircraft shell. Because of the TV program Dad's Army, one of the most famous and familiar institutions of World War II is the Home Guard. In May 1940, the government minister Anthony Eden made an appeal on the BBC for volunteers for a local defence force. 350 Kidderminster men had volunteered by the end of the following week. The local defence volunteers were commanded by Colonel R.W.A. Painter, who was, so to speak, the town's Captain Mannering. Their name became the Home Guard in 1941. The Kidderminster contingent was stood down on the 3rd of December 1944, at which date the strength of the force nationally was 1,718,000 men. Kidderminster today is not the town which Richard Baxter knew. It's not even the town which Rowland Hill knew. The 20th century has not been kind to the town, and it's developed in ways familiar from many other English towns. Not one of the 5 cinemas which the town once had remains. There's been a proliferation of housing estates at Haverley, Spennels and Offmore, for example, while the town centre has few residents and has on occasion the look and feel of an urban wilderness. The century has seen the closure of a number of carpet factories and the mushrooming of supermarkets. There's been the loss of several important historical buildings through age, decay and the demands of the motor car. Yet the town has faced and survived greater difficulties and greater changes in its past. For example, in the locust years 1840 to 1860. The emergence of the Kidderminster Civic Society and the publication of large numbers of books of local interest testify both to an increasing concern with Kidderminster's past and to a determination that the losses earlier this century of buildings of historical and aesthetic importance shall not be repeated. The proposed redevelopment of the town centre will offer the opportunity to give new life and vigour to the heart of the town. Kidderminster may approach the millennium with gratitude for the achievements of the past, hope for the future, and a belief that its historical heritage should not suffer any further unnecessary erosion.